Some of the deepest wounds in your life were caused by people who smiled in your face while quietly damaging your spirit behind the scenes. That's what made the pain so confusing. It wasn't open hatred. It was hidden disrespect disguised as support. Subtle manipulation disguised as concern. They celebrated you publicly but competed with you privately. And because you carried a good heart, you kept giving them the benefit of the doubt long after your spirit started feeling the weight of their intentions. Chosen ones often suffer this way, not because they are weak, but because they see the good in people even when people are secretly operating from envy, insecurity, or hidden resentment. You stayed loyal. You stayed patient. You kept trying to maintain peace while silently absorbing emotional pressure nobody else could see. And the difficult part is that most of your suffering happened in silence. People around you never fully noticed how much energy was being drained from you behind closed doors. They didn't see the emotional exhaustion, the subtle disrespect, the constant tension you carried after certain conversations or interactions. But heaven saw it all. Every moment you stayed quiet to avoid conflict. Every time you protected people who were slowly harming your peace. Every sacrifice you made while others took advantage of your kindness. Nothing escaped God's attention. And while they assumed your silence meant ignorance, heaven recognized it as restraint. That's why things are beginning to shift now. Because there comes a point where God no longer allows hidden behavior to remain hidden. The same people who underestimated your discernment will eventually be confronted by the consequences of what they carried in secret. Not because you sought revenge, but because truth has a way of revealing itself over time. What they thought would stay buried is slowly coming to the surface. And the unsettling part for them is this. They never realized heaven was watching the entire time. One of the most painful experiences for a chosen person is realizing that the people you defended the most were often the very ones quietly working against your peace. At first, the signs were subtle, small inconsistencies, strange energy shifts, moments that left your spirit unsettled, even when nothing obvious had happened. You tried to ignore it because loyalty made you patient, empathy made you understanding, and your heart kept searching for innocent explanations instead of accepting what your spirit was already trying to reveal. That's the difficult part about being chosen. You often see the potential in people before you see their intentions. So you continue showing kindness long after the warning signs appear. You continue giving grace where boundaries should have existed. And because of that, God sometimes has to expose people gradually through patterns instead of dramatic revelations. That's exactly what began happening in your life. You started noticing that certain people only supported you when you were struggling, but became uncomfortable when you started growing. Some celebrated your pain more than your progress. Others acted supportive publicly while quietly minimizing your worth in private. There were conversations that felt strangely heavy afterward, moments where your energy dropped without explanation, and interactions that left you emotionally drained, even though nothing openly negative had been said. Your mind tried to rationalize it, but your spirit kept feeling the truth, because spirits recognize what words attempt to hide. And eventually, God will no longer allow a chosen person to remain blind to what is secretly damaging them. That's why the exposure often feels emotionally overwhelming. It forces you to confront the painful reality that not everyone around you truly wanted your peace. Some people wanted access to your energy without genuinely honoring your spirit. Some wanted the comfort of your presence while quietly resenting your light. And perhaps the hardest truth of all is realizing that hidden envy rarely announces itself loudly. It disguises itself through passive disrespect, subtle competition, emotional inconsistency, and quiet dishonor that slowly erodes your peace over time. But heaven sees what human eyes often miss. God notices every hidden intention behind every interaction. Every forced smile, every manipulative word disguised as concern, every moment someone secretly celebrated your setbacks while pretending to support your healing. Nothing remains hidden forever. And when God begins exposing truth, he often does it in ways nobody can control. Masks begin slipping naturally. Patterns repeat too consistently to ignore. Contradictions become impossible to explain away. The same people you once defended start revealing themselves through their own behavior without you needing to expose them at all. That's the power of divine revelation. It removes the burden from your hands and places truth directly into the light. And for many chosen people, this season feels deeply disorienting because the exposure changes how you see everything. Relationships you once trusted begin feeling unfamiliar. Conversations start sounding different. You become more aware of hidden motives, subtle jealousy, and emotional manipulation that previously went unnoticed because your loyalty kept filtering reality through compassion. But compassion without discernment can become self-destruction. God knew that if he did not reveal the truth, you would have continued carrying people who were quietly draining your spirit while pretending to care about your well-being. So the discomfort increased, the distance became unavoidable, the emotional clarity became sharper, and suddenly the same people you once felt deeply connected to no longer felt spiritually safe. That realization hurts because chosen people do not detach easily. You genuinely wanted peace. You genuinely wanted the relationships to be real. But God was revealing something your heart was struggling to accept. Not everyone who has access to you deserves access to you. Some people were assigned to your life only for a season, and their hidden intentions made it impossible for them to continue where God was taking you next. That is why the exposure had to happen before the separation. Because if God removed them too early, you would have chased understanding instead of accepting truth. So he allowed patterns to repeat until your spirit could no longer ignore what your emotions kept trying to excuse. And slowly, your discernment started replacing denial. You stopped over-explaining your discomfort. You stopped forcing yourself to feel safe around energy that constantly disturbed your peace. You became quieter, more observant, more protective of your spirit. Not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. Because once God reveals what someone truly carries in secret, you can never fully return to seeing them the same way again. And that realization marks the beginning of true separation. Not driven by anger, revenge, or emotional reaction, but by clarity. The kind of clarity heaven gives when it finally decides you have suffered in confusion long enough. What surprises many chosen people is that justice rarely begins with dramatic confrontation. It begins quietly, subtly, almost invisibly at first. While others expect immediate consequences, heaven often allows truth to unfold slowly, with precision instead of chaos. And that is exactly why many people never recognize when judgment has already started entering their lives. They assume they escaped accountability because nothing happened immediately after they caused harm. They continue moving through life, believing their hidden behavior went unnoticed, especially when the person they wounded remained silent. But silence does not mean heaven ignored what happened. In many cases, your silence was the very reason God stepped in personally. Because there is something spiritually significant about a chosen person who suffers betrayal without becoming consumed by revenge. You could have exposed people publicly. You could have reacted emotionally, created conflict, or fought to defend yourself at every moment. But instead, you carried wounds quietly while trying to preserve your peace. And heaven saw every moment of restraint. Every night, you questioned yourself because of the confusion others created. Every time you stayed calm while secretly carrying emotional pain nobody else understood. What they interpreted as weakness was actually mercy delaying consequences they did not yet realize were forming around them. Because the truth is, hidden behavior eventually begins producing visible effects. Not always through dramatic punishment, but through disruption. Confusion enters places where manipulation once thrived. Peace disappears from lives built on dishonesty. Relationships become unstable. Opportunities begin collapsing unexpectedly. And the unsettling part for them is that they often cannot fully explain why everything suddenly feels heavy. That is how spiritual consequences begin, quietly, internally, long before they become visible externally. People who secretly carried envy toward you start becoming consumed by comparison. Those who manipulated your kindness begin encountering resistance everywhere they go. Those who enjoyed draining your energy slowly lose access to the very peace they took for granted. Not because you cursed them, not because you sought revenge, but because actions rooted in hidden darkness eventually separate people from alignment, clarity, and peace. Heaven does not operate through emotional chaos. It operates through balance, and balance always corrects what has been done in secret. That's why chosen people are often told not to retaliate during seasons of betrayal. Not because the pain is insignificant, but because God sees deeper than human emotion. He sees motives, patterns, intentions, and spiritual consequences long before people recognize them themselves. And when heaven decides to reveal truth, no manipulation can permanently hide it. You may have already started noticing the shift. Certain people who once appeared confident suddenly seem restless. Others who quietly worked against you are now struggling with instability in areas they once controlled easily. Some relationships around them begin deteriorating for reasons they cannot fully explain. Their masks become harder to maintain. Their energy becomes heavier, and slowly, the same confusion they once projected onto you starts surrounding their own lives. This is not coincidence. It is the natural consequence of carrying hidden dishonor for too long. Because energy rooted in deception eventually collapses under its own weight. And perhaps the most powerful part of this season is realizing you no longer feel the need to fight back. That urge begins disappearing once your spirit understands that God truly saw everything. Chosen people often exhaust themselves, trying to explain their pain to people who were committed to misunderstanding them from the beginning. But eventually, heaven teaches you something deeper. Truth does not need constant defense when God is already exposing it through time. That realization changes your posture completely. You become calmer, more detached from the need to prove yourself, more willing to let actions reveal character naturally instead of trying to convince others what happened behind closed doors. Because once divine justice begins moving, human interference becomes unnecessary. And that is what unsettles people the most. Your peace, your silence, your refusal to become consumed by bitterness while consequences quietly unfold around them. They expected reaction. They expected emotional chaos. They expected you to remain wounded forever. Instead, they are witnessing something they did not anticipate. Your spirit becoming stronger while their hidden behavior slowly begins unraveling their own peace. That is the part they never prepared for. Heaven was never asleep during your suffering. Every hidden betrayal was recorded. Every secret wound was witnessed. Every manipulative intention was seen clearly long before you fully understood it yourself. And now, without you needing to force anything, Truth is beginning to separate itself from illusion, quietly, precisely, inevitably, because some consequences do not arrive through revenge. They arrive through divine balance, finally correcting what people thought would remain hidden forever. One of the hardest truths for chosen people to accept is that sometimes God separates you from people, not because you stopped loving them, but because your spirit could no longer survive around what they secretly carried. That kind of separation feels different. It is not driven by anger or dramatic conflict. In fact, many times nothing obvious even happens externally. The conversations may still seem normal. The connection may still technically exist. But internally, something begins pulling away. Your energy changes around certain people. You start feeling emotionally exhausted after interactions that once felt effortless. Your spirit becomes heavy in environments where you used to feel comfortable. And the confusing part is that your mind keeps trying to preserve connections your spirit already recognizes as unsafe. That internal conflict is deeply painful because chosen people naturally want peace. You wanted harmony, you wanted loyalty, you wanted the relationships to remain genuine. But God was allowing you to feel what your eyes could not yet fully see. Because spirits detect hidden hostility long before the mind accepts it logically. That is why your body often reacted before your understanding did. The anxiety, the emotional heaviness, the exhaustion after certain conversations, the constant feeling that you had to monitor your energy around specific people. None of it was random. Your spirit was responding to hidden tension your heart kept trying to excuse. And over time, God intensified that discomfort intentionally, not to confuse you, but to free you. Because the longer a chosen person remains connected to hidden dishonor, the deeper the emotional damage becomes. People underestimate how destructive concealed resentment can be. Someone does not need to openly attack you to affect your peace. Hidden envy changes energy. Secret bitterness contaminates connection. Manipulative intentions create emotional instability, even when words appear kind on the surface. And because chosen people are spiritually sensitive, they often absorb these environments more deeply than others realize. That is why you became so exhausted. You were carrying emotional tension that was never yours to carry in the first place. You kept trying to maintain relationships that required you to ignore your discernment just to preserve temporary comfort. But eventually, God will not allow your spirit to keep shrinking itself to maintain connections rooted in hidden darkness. So the separation began, quietly, gradually, through emotional distance, repeated discomfort, and growing clarity you could no longer suppress. At first, you questioned yourself. You wondered if you were becoming too distant, too sensitive, too withdrawn. But the deeper truth was this: your spirit was finally rejecting what your survival instincts had normalized for years. And once that awakening begins, it becomes impossible to fully return to unconscious attachment. You started noticing how peaceful you felt away from certain people, how your mind became clearer in their absence, how your energy slowly stabilized once you stopped forcing yourself to remain emotionally available to those who secretly depleted you. That realization changes everything because it exposes how much hidden pressure your spirit had been carrying all along. And perhaps the most difficult part of divine separation is understanding that not everyone meant to enter your life is meant to continue with you. Some people were only assigned to specific seasons. Some connections were never built to survive your spiritual growth. And others lost alignment with you the moment hidden envy, resentment, or dishonor entered the relationship. God saw what staying connected would eventually cost you emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. He saw how certain environments slowly weakened your confidence, disrupted your peace, and distracted you from your purpose. So he intervened before the damage became irreversible, not always through dramatic endings, but through internal awakening. He made your spirit uncomfortable enough that you could no longer ignore what your heart was still trying to protect. That is what divine extraction feels like. Painful, confusing, but necessary. And eventually, you stopped chasing what no longer felt aligned. You stopped forcing access to people who constantly disturbed your peace. You stopped over-explaining your boundaries to those who benefited from your lack of them. Instead, you became quieter, more discerning, more protective of your energy. Not because you became cold, but because God taught you the cost of remaining connected to hidden darkness for too long. And slowly your peace returned, your clarity returned. Your emotional balance started rebuilding itself in ways you had not felt in years. That is when you finally understood something powerful. The separation was never punishment. It was protection. Heaven was not trying to isolate you from love. It was removing you from environments where your spirit was being silently wounded, while your loyalty kept trying to call it connection. And now that the distance exists, you can finally see clearly what your heart struggled to accept while you were still emotionally attached to it. What many people fail to understand is that heaven never exposes betrayal without also repositioning the chosen person afterward. That is the part hidden beneath all the pain, confusion, and separation. While you were grieving relationships, questioning yourself, and trying to understand why certain people suddenly revealed such disappointing sides of themselves, God was already preparing a new version of your life beyond the betrayal. But before that repositioning could happen, something inside you had to change first. Because chosen people often enter painful seasons carrying too much emotional access, too much loyalty without discernment, too much willingness to ignore their own spirit just to preserve connection. And betrayal has a way of forcing transformation where comfort once prevented it. That is why this season altered you so deeply. You no longer move through life with the same emotional innocence. You no longer ignore red flags just because your heart wants to see the good in everyone. You no longer abandon your own peace trying to maintain relationships that constantly require self-sacrifice to survive. The pain sharpened your discernment. The silence strengthened your intuition. And the separation taught you the difference between genuine connection and emotional dependency, disguised as loyalty. At first, the transformation felt lonely because growth often creates distance before it creates alignment. You outgrew conversations that once felt normal. You stopped forcing yourself to remain emotionally available to people who only valued your presence when it benefited them. Even your energy changed. You became calmer, quieter, more intentional with who receives access to your spirit. And some people interpreted that shift as arrogance or distance because they were accustomed to the version of you that overextended itself to keep everyone comfortable. But heaven was not rebuilding you to remain emotionally exhausted forever. God was repositioning you into a life where your peace would no longer depend on constantly tolerating hidden disrespect. That repositioning changes everything because it alters not only your circumstances, but your entire relationship with yourself. You begin trusting your discernment instead of doubting it. You stop seeking external validation for what your spirit already recognizes internally. You become more comfortable walking away from misalignment instead of trying to rescue every connection through endless understanding and emotional labor. That is spiritual maturity. And ironically, the same betrayal that once nearly broke you becomes the very thing that awakens your boundaries, your clarity, and your inner authority. You start realizing that God allowed certain people to reveal themselves, not to destroy your faith in others, but to strengthen your discernment moving forward. Because where heaven is taking you next requires emotional discipline, not endless emotional accessibility. It requires wisdom, not naive attachment. And perhaps the most powerful part of this transformation is that you no longer need revenge to feel validated. That need slowly disappears once your spirit understands that God already saw everything. You stop obsessing over proving your pain to people who were committed to misunderstanding you from the beginning. Instead, you focus on protecting your peace, rebuilding your spirit, and aligning yourself with what genuinely honors your growth. That shift unsettles people more than anger ever could, because they expected the betrayal to permanently wound you. They expected you to remain emotionally trapped in confusion, bitterness, or self-doubt. Instead, they are witnessing something they cannot control: your evolution. The same situations that were meant to drain your spirit ended up strengthening your discernment. The same rejection that once hurt you created the separation necessary for your next season. The same silence that felt lonely became the place where God rebuilt your identity without distraction. And now you move differently. You trust differently. You protect your peace differently. Not from fear, but from wisdom earned through suffering. So that is the hidden purpose behind divine repositioning. Heaven was never only removing people from your life. It was rebuilding you into someone who could no longer be manipulated by hidden intentions, false loyalty, or emotional confusion. Every painful revelation carried a lesson your future required. Every separation sharpened your awareness. Every disappointment exposed where your spirit had been settling for less than alignment. And one day you will fully understand why none of it could remain hidden forever. Because your next season required clarity more than comfort. It required truth more than temporary attachment. It required a version of you that no longer ignored discernment just to avoid loneliness. And that is exactly who you are becoming now. Not broken by betrayal, but refined through it. Not destroyed by hidden wounds, but repositioned by heaven into deeper peace, stronger boundaries, and a level of spiritual clarity that can no longer be manipulated by what once deceived you in secret.